By the fall of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had done something no other submarine force in the war had managed. Its boats had removed 2 American aircraft carriers from the Pacific in a matter of days, left the United States Navy with exactly 1 operational carrier in the entire ocean, and done it in conditions that suggested the campaign against American warships was only going to accelerate. The Japanese I-class submarines were extraordinary machines, nearly 350 feet long, with ranges of 20,000 miles, capable of carrying their own floatplanes. Germany's famous U-boats had a range of 7,000 to 8,000 miles. The I-boats could go nearly 3 times as far. Japan had built 4 decades of industrial effort into these machines, specifically to fight the American fleet. But there was one thing the Japanese submarine commanders weren't doing. They weren't attacking merchant ships. And that decision, which made complete sense inside the doctrine that had built the Imperial Japanese Navy, turned out to be the most consequential mistake of the entire submarine war. Japan had been thinking about a war with the United States Navy since the first decade of the 20th century. The scenario that Japanese naval planners rehearsed for decades was called the decisive battle concept. In this model, the American Pacific Fleet would steam west from Pearl Harbor to relieve whatever Japan had just seized. A series of attrition operations would whittle it down, and then the combined Imperial Fleet would destroy what remained in a single climactic surface engagement. Submarines, in this doctrine, had a specific role. They would be the attrition agents. Positioned in picket lines between Hawaii and Japan, they would attack American warships as the fleet moved westward, reducing it by 1/3 or 1/4 before the decisive battle. They would gather intelligence on the American fleet's composition and movement. They would serve as scouts for the surface force. What they would not do was attack merchant shipping. Attacking merchants was called guerre de course, a French term for commerce warfare. The Japanese Naval Academy taught that commerce warfare was a lesser strategy, appropriate for weaker naval powers that couldn't achieve fleet dominance, but not for a first-rate navy with a first-rate fleet. The Japanese Navy was a first-rate fleet. Its submarines would fight like first-rate submarines, against warships. The I-class design reflected this thinking. These were not the kind of submarines you used to creep along coastal routes looking for tankers. They were fleet submarines, designed for blue water operation across the vast Pacific, fast enough to keep up with surface groups, large enough to carry the fuel and provisions for months-long patrols, capable of operating far from any support base. They were extraordinary technical achievements for 1941, and they were built entirely for the wrong mission. The officers who designed this doctrine were not fools. The decisive battle concept had a certain strategic logic. If you could destroy the American fleet before it could bring its industrial advantages to bear, then Japan's initial conquests could be consolidated before American production overwhelmed the defense. The submarine force's role in attriting the American fleet before the decisive battle was a coherent part of a coherent strategy. The problem was that the strategy depended on Japan winning a quick war. And when the quick war didn't happen, the submarine doctrine had no good answer for the long war that followed. German submarine doctrine, by contrast, was built for a long war of attrition against commerce. Dönitz had designed the Wolfpack tactics and the tonnage war specifically because he understood that Germany could not defeat Britain in a short war and had to strangle its supply lines over time. This was the doctrine the Japanese might have applied to American supply lines across the Pacific, and they didn't, because their entire strategic framework assumed a different kind of war. The irony that shapes this whole story is that Japan, an island nation entirely dependent on sea lanes for oil, food, metal, and rubber, built one of the most capable submarine fleets in the world and used it to attack warships. Meanwhile, the United States used its submarines to strangle Japan's merchant fleet. One side used its submarines exactly right. The other side used its submarines the way its doctrine told it to, and the doctrine was wrong. In the late summer of 1942, the Japanese submarine commanders had reason to believe their doctrine was working. The United States Pacific Fleet had entered the war already bruised from Pearl Harbor. The battle groups built around carriers were the only offensive force it had, and the carriers were being consumed. Lexington had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. Yorktown had been sunk at Midway in June. Wasp was operating in the South Pacific as one of the remaining fleet carriers available to support the Guadalcanal campaign, which the Marines had landed in August. In September, in the waters south of the Solomon Islands, Commander Yokota torpedoed Saratoga for the second time in the war with IE-26. She had already been torpedoed by II-6 in January of 1942, southwest of Pearl Harbor, which had put her out of action until June and cost her the Battle of Midway. The I-6 attack had happened 420 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, early enough in the war that the full implications of submarine vulnerability hadn't yet shaped American carrier deployment. Now, in August, Saratoga was hit again and sent to Tongatabu for repairs. That left Wasp and Hornet as the only operational American carriers in the Pacific. Each of them was doing the work of 3 ships, providing air cover, escorting convoys, supporting the Guadalcanal, landings, and standing as the only barrier between the Marines on that island and Japanese air and surface power. When one of them was damaged or out of position, the other carried the full load. The margin for error in that situation was not comfortable at all. 2 weeks after Saratoga was torpedoed the second time, Commander Takakazu Kinashi took his submarine, I-19, into a position south of the Solomon Islands and found Wasp. She was the duty carrier that day, and her task group was escorting a convoy carrying the 7th Marine Regiment to Guadalcanal. Kinashi fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 of them hit the Wasp. Kinashi had aimed for Wasp, but his torpedo spread was wider than he needed. The other 3 torpedoes kept traveling. They covered 5 miles across open water before intersecting the task group formed around the Hornet, which was steaming to the northeast. 1 torpedo hit the battleship North Carolina on her port side. 1 torpedo hit the destroyer O'Brien, which would later sink in October while on her way to a repair yard. The 3rd passed clear. The Wasp was doomed by the initial hits. The fires spread to her aviation fuel. Her damage control teams, with power knocked out by the explosions, couldn't contain the fires. She was abandoned and scuttled. Kinashi had sunk an aircraft carrier, sunk a destroyer, and severely damaged a battleship with 6 torpedoes. It was one of the most destructive torpedo spreads in the history of submarine warfare. With Enterprise under repair after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and Saratoga heading for Tongatabu, only Hornet remained operational. The United States Pacific Fleet had 1 aircraft carrier in a war that required carriers for every major operation. Commander Minoru Yokota and his crew aboard the submarine I-26 had a busy war. Yokota had been one of the Japanese submarine commanders deployed to the American West Coast immediately after Pearl Harbor, one of a group tasked with disrupting American shipping in the weeks before the Pacific War's opening. Moves became clear. I-26 spent time patrolling off the coasts of Oregon, Washington, and Vancouver Island. In June of 1942, she bombarded the settlement of Estevan Point on Vancouver Island with her deck gun, the first attack on Canadian soil by a foreign power since 1870. That same patrol took her to the waters off Oregon, where the bombardment of Fort Stevens would shortly follow. But the action that defined I-26's war record came on the morning of August 31st, 1942. After midnight, I-26 was on the surface, recharging her batteries northwest of Espiritu Santo, when her bridge lookout spotted distant lights. Yokota identified the lights as an American task force and submerged. The battleship North Carolina picked up I-26 on radar at 3:30 in the morning and sent a destroyer to investigate, but the submarine dived deep and the destroyer lost contact. After 3 hours at depth, Yokota surfaced to find the task force gone. He searched without result. As he prepared to give up and return to his patrol area, a lookout spotted a vessel resembling a large tanker at long range. Yokota looked again and realized it was a carrier. It was the Saratoga. He fired 6 torpedoes. A steering malfunction in 1 torpedo sent it broaching at the surface. 4 others missed as Saratoga executed evasive turns, but 1 torpedo hit Saratoga on her starboard side, flooding her aftermost fire room and knocking out her electrical systems. The heavy cruiser, Minneapolis, took her under tow. By noon, Saratoga had corrected her list and was under her own power, but she needed repairs. She was out of the war for weeks. That was August. In November, I-26 was in the waters off Guadalcanal during the naval battle of November 13th. The battle left the light cruiser Juno severely damaged from a torpedo hit during the surface engagement. As the Juno withdrew, unable to maneuver effectively, I-26 spotted her and fired. 1 torpedo hit. The The Juno exploded, apparently when the torpedo reached her ammunition magazine. She went under in 20 seconds. There were 687 men aboard. Of them, 115 survived the initial explosion. 10 made it to rescue. Among those who died were 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. The 5 Sullivan brothers, Joseph, Francis, Albert, Madison, and George, had enlisted together and served together on the Juno, despite Navy regulations that discouraged brothers from serving on the same ship. All 5 died when I-26's torpedo hit. Their deaths prompted the passage of the sole survivor policy in the United States, under which surviving family members of servicemen could be removed from combat duty. On the evening of June 21st, 1942, the Coastal Defense Post at Fort Stevens, at the mouth of the Columbia River, in Oregon, heard the sound of naval gunfire coming from the ocean. The Japanese submarine I-17, under Commander Kozo Nishino, had surfaced after dark and brought her deck gun into action. 17 shells landed in the vicinity of the fort. None caused serious damage. No American personnel were killed or wounded. The shore batteries at Fort Stevens were ordered not to return fire because the soldiers couldn't see the submarine clearly, and returning fire would have given away the battery positions. But the shells had landed. A foreign power had fired on an American military installation on continental American soil for the first time since the War of 1812. The Army officer who commanded Fort Stevens, Colonel Caldoni, received intense criticism for ordering his men not to return fire. His reasoning, that the submarine was operating at a range where counter-battery fire would have been ineffective, while revealing the gun's locations, was tactically sound. It was not the kind of reasoning that calmed an angry public. I-17 was not done with the Oregon coast. In September of 1942, a submarine-based floatplane from another Japanese boat, I-25, made 2 incendiary bombing raids over the Oregon forest southeast of the coast. The pilot, Nobuo Fujita, dropped bombs intended to start forest fires. The attacks produced small fires that were quickly contained. They were the only attacks on the continental United States by foreign aircraft in the war. Fujita would later visit the Oregon town of Brookings multiple times in the post-war years, and the city eventually made him an honorary citizen. By the time the Japanese submarine force had achieved its greatest successes against American warships in the fall of 1942, the structural failure in its doctrine was already visible in the strategic picture. Japan needed oil. The oil was in the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia. The oil had to be shipped north to the home islands, through the sea lanes of the Western Pacific. Japan's entire war economy, its military's ability to operate aircraft, ships, tanks, and trucks, depended on those tankers making that run. The American submarine force had been given a doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare within hours of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, sent the signal: execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. American submarines began attacking Japanese merchant shipping immediately. They were hampered in the first 2 years by defective Mark 14 torpedoes that often ran too deep or failed to detonate, a problem that wasn't fully corrected until late 1943. Even with defective weapons, American submarines were hitting Japanese merchants. Once the torpedoes were fixed, the campaign accelerated dramatically. By 1943, American submarines were sinking more than 1.5 million tons of Japanese shipping per year. In 1944, that number doubled to 3 million tons. Japan's convoy system was poorly organized and inadequately defended. The Imperial Japanese Navy had never developed effective destroyer escorts specifically for convoy duty. The destroyers it did assign to convoy escort were fleet destroyers designed for fleet combat, not the kind of specialized anti-submarine platform that the Battle of the Atlantic had forced the British and Americans to develop. The result was that American submarines could attack Japanese convoys with a consistency and effectiveness that the German U-boats never achieved against Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Think about what that means in concrete terms. By the end of 1944, American submarines had sunk so much Japanese tanker tonnage that Japan's oil tanks were running dry. The aircraft that needed aviation fuel weren't getting it. The ships that needed bunker oil weren't getting it. The army in China and the Philippines and the Pacific Islands wasn't getting the fuel it needed for its vehicles and equipment. The Japanese economy was choking. None of that was happening to the United States, because the Japanese submarines were doing something else entirely. The Japanese Navy understood, at some level, that commerce raiding was a valid naval strategy. It had watched German U-boats nearly strangle Britain in 1917 and again in the early years of this war. The fact that its own doctrine prohibited similar operations didn't mean the idea hadn't occurred to Japanese planners. What had occurred to them instead was something stranger and more ambitious: submarines that could fly. The I-400 class was the largest submarine ever built up to that point in history. Each boat was 400 feet long, 6,500 tons submerged, with a range sufficient for 90-day cruises, more than enough to reach the American west coast from Japan and return. In the enormous cylindrical hangar built into the hull, each I-400 class boat carried 3 Aichi M6A Siren floatplane bombers. These aircraft could be assembled on deck, launched from a catapult, and if a landing airfield was available, recovered for multiple strikes. Japan built 41 submarines capable of carrying aircraft of some kind. No other navy in the world built any. The original plan for the I-400 class was to attack American cities. The sheer range of the boats made the American Pacific coast reachable. The plan was later changed to target the Panama Canal, which, if destroyed, would have forced American warships to route around South America rather than transiting between oceans. The canal attack could have significantly complicated Allied naval planning. The attack never happened. When the I-400 boats were ready to deploy, Japan couldn't find enough fuel for the mission. The fuel problem was caused, in large measure, by American submarines sinking the tankers that were supposed to bring oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. The weapon built to destroy American targets couldn't sail because American submarines had already destroyed what it needed to operate. As the war turned against Japan, the mission of the I-class submarines shifted from offensive operations to something much more desperate. Bypassed island garrisons across the Pacific were being cut off from resupply as American forces advanced and American air power denied the sea lanes to surface ships. Truk Atoll, Rabaul, Guadalcanal in the early months of the campaign, and dozens of smaller island garrisons were slowly starving. Japanese submarines were pressed into service as supply carriers. A submarine is not designed to carry meaningful cargo. The internal volume of even a large I-class boat, divided among engines, batteries, torpedoes, crew quarters, and fuel, left very little room for the kind of bulk supplies an isolated garrison needed. The boats could carry small amounts of medical supplies, ammunition, and food, at enormous risk to their crews operating in the shallow waters around defended islands. The submarines that had been designed for blue water fleet operations were threading through reef-studded channels at night to deliver a few tons of supplies to men who needed hundreds of tons. Those missions exposed the I-boats to American anti-submarine forces in exactly the conditions that maximized the American advantage. Shallow water limited a submarine's ability to dive deep to evade. Known supply routes allowed American forces to position patrols at predictable points. The I-19, the boat that had fired the most destructive torpedo spread of the Pacific War, was sunk by the American destroyer Radford in November of 1943, near the island of Tarawa. She was on a supply run. By 1944, American submarine forces had developed the kind of coordinated group tactics, radar-guided night attacks, and hunter-killer teams that the Allies had deployed against German U-boats in the Atlantic. The combination of better weapons, better doctrine, and the inherent advantage of knowing where the Japanese supply runs had to go produced a loss rate among Japanese submarines that was unsustainable. Of the 174 Japanese submarines that operated in the war, 128 were lost. More than 3 out of 4. The American submarine campaign against Japan has become one of the most celebrated naval stories of the Second World War. What gets less attention is how badly it started and why. The standard American submarine torpedo in December of 1941 was the Mark 14. It was supposed to run at a depth of 15 feet and explode either on contact or magnetically when it passed under a ship's keel. In practice, it ran an average of 11 feet deeper than its set depth. A torpedo aimed to pass under a ship's keel at 15 feet was actually running at 26 feet, passing harmlessly beneath. The magnetic exploder was also defective. It was supposed to detonate when the torpedo's magnetic field sensor detected the change in Earth's magnetic field created by a ship's steel hull. In practice, it detonated prematurely, or failed to detonate at all, or detonated on contact, only to find that the contact exploder was also defective and failed to function reliably. American submarine commanders were reporting these problems from the first patrols of the war. Their reports went to the Bureau of Ordnance, which had developed and tested the Mark 14 in controlled conditions on a range in Rhode Island. The Bureau insisted the problems were with the commanders, not the torpedoes. The controlled range tests had shown the weapon performing correctly. The fact that it wasn't performing correctly in combat was, in the Bureau's assessment, a human failure. This continued for nearly 2 years. From December 1941 through late 1943, American submarine commanders were going to sea with weapons they had good reason to believe didn't work. They were filing patrol reports describing torpedo failures in detail, and those reports were being received by a bureaucracy that declined to act. It was not until 1943 that a series of direct tests conducted by submarine fleet commanders, rather than the Bureau of Ordnance, definitively proved what the submarine commanders had been saying for 2 years. The depth keeping was defective. The magnetic exploder was defective. The contact exploder in the Mark 14 had a pin that shattered on direct impact rather than detonating the warhead. The weapon that American submariners had been trusting their lives to was failing in multiple, independent ways, simultaneously. The fixes took time. The full correction of all known defects wasn't completed until late 1943, 23 months into the war. The 2 years of correctable deficiency cost an unknown number of ships that should have been sunk and weren't. The extent of the waste can be estimated but not definitively known, because a torpedo that ran too deep produced no evidence. It just ran to the end of its power and sank. While the American submarine force was fighting its own torpedo problems, specific boats and commanders were producing results that justified the campaign, even in its troubled early years. On June 19, 1944, 2 American submarines were operating as part of the Pacific Submarine Force at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The battle was shaping up as the decisive carrier engagement that Japanese doctrine had predicted for 40 years. The Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled 9 carriers. The Americans had 15. The submarine Albacore, commanded by Commander James Blanchard, was in position off Tawi-Tawi when the Japanese carrier force sailed. She was tracking the fleet carrier Taiho, the largest carrier the Japanese Navy had ever built, launched just months before and considered nearly unsinkable because of her armored flight deck. Blanchard fired 6 torpedoes. 1 hit the Taiho's forward elevator. The damage didn't immediately seem fatal. The carrier continued operating and recovered aircraft. But the torpedo had ruptured an aviation fuel tank, and the fumes were accumulating in the ship's ventilation system. When the fumes reached ignition point, the explosion that followed was catastrophic. The Taiho sank in about 8 hours, taking 1,700 men with her. Within hours of the Taiho attack, the submarine Kavala, commanded by Commander Herman Kostler, found the fleet carrier Shikaku. Shikaku was one of the carriers that had launched the aircraft that attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Kostler fired 4 torpedoes and 3 hit. The Shikaku sank in about 3 hours. On the same day the Taiho and Shikaku were sinking, Japanese aircraft from the remaining carriers were attacking the American fleet. The air crews were poorly trained replacements for experienced flyers lost in earlier battles. American fighter pilots flying Hellcats shot down nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in what American aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese fleet lost 2 fleet carriers and 373 aircraft in one day. American submarines had sunk 2 of the 3 Japanese carrier losses at the Philippine Sea. The battle had been partly decided underwater by 2 submarine commanders who placed their boats at exactly the right point at exactly the right moment. The men who served on Japanese submarines are less well documented in English language sources than the crews of American or German boats, partly because so few of them survived to write memoirs. Of the 128 Japanese submarines lost in the war, most left no survivors. The loss rate of roughly 3/4 exceeded even the German U-boat service's terrible casualty figures. What the available records suggest is that the Japanese submarine service underwent a similar psychological transformation to the German U-boat arm, moving from a confident elite force in the early part of the war to a service that by 1943 and 44 was sending crews out on missions that the commanders could not have believed were going to succeed. The supply missions to bypassed garrisons were particularly grim. Imagine commanding an I-class submarine designed for blue water fleet operations, now ordered to thread through the shallow reef-strewn waters around an island like Guadalcanal at night, carrying perhaps 50 tons of food and medicine for a garrison of thousands who needed tons more, knowing that the American patrol forces were specifically watching the approaches for exactly this operation. The crew of I-3, which was sunk in the waters off Guadalcanal in December of 1942 on a supply run, had served in the submarine since before the war. They had trained for fleet operations, for the kind of blue water engagement the decisive battle doctrine promised. What they found instead was a night run to a besieged island, with American destroyers waiting on the approach routes. The I-boats that made the supply runs to Guadalcanal during the final months of the campaign in early 1943 knew the island was being evacuated, and they still went. They were delivering supplies to men who were being taken off the island even as the boats arrived. The missions were continued, not because they were achieving anything decisive, but because stopping them would have been an acknowledgement that the garrison was doomed. And Japanese military culture in 1942 and 43 had not yet found a way to acknowledge that some garrisons were doomed. The American anti-submarine campaign in the Pacific developed differently from the Atlantic campaign, partly because the threat was different. German U-boats were trying to sink merchant ships in open ocean. Japanese submarines were trying to sink warships, supply bypassed island garrisons, and stay alive in waters increasingly controlled by American forces. The American response was tailored to find submarines operating in known patrol areas and known supply routes. The key advantage American forces developed was signals intelligence. By 1943, American code-breaking operations had cracked significant portions of Japanese naval communications. This meant that American anti-submarine forces frequently knew the location and mission of specific Japanese submarines before those submarines arrived at their patrol areas. A Japanese submarine ordered to supply the Truk garrison, transmitting its position and estimated arrival time on an encrypted radio frequency that American stations were monitoring, was a Japanese submarine that American destroyers could position themselves to intercept. The destroyer Manlove, the destroyer Charette, and the destroyer Connor sank I-35 in November of 1943 near Tarawa. The I-35 had been on a supply run, navigating the predictable approach corridor that American signal intelligence had identified. She was caught on the surface at night by radar, pursued when she dived, and sunk with depth charges. Her crew of 89 died. The submarine I-22 was sunk in the Coral Sea in October of 1942. I-29 was sunk in the Luzon Strait in July of 1944 by the submarine Sawfish, a 44 by the submarine Sawfish, a reminder that American submarines were also hunting Japanese submarines. I-41 was sunk by the destroyer Chanticleer in November of 1943. I-40 was sunk by the destroyer escort Wyman in February of 1944. The list goes on through 1943 and 1944 with the same rhythm. Japanese submarine, American warship or aircraft, brief engagement, sinking. As the battles for the Philippines, Iwo, Jima, and Okinawa brought American forces closer to the Japanese home islands, the operational environment for Japanese submarines became steadily more hostile. More American surface forces, more American aircraft, and better American radar coverage left Japanese submarines with shrinking windows to operate safely. The shallow waters around the Pacific island chains, where so many supply runs had to go, were the worst possible environments for submarines that needed depth to escape. By early 1945, the Japanese submarine force was barely operational as a coherent fighting force. The boats that remained were being committed to kamikaze-style operations, some of them modified to carry human-guided torpedoes called kaiten, which were essentially one-way weapons with a man inside. The kaiten were one-person submarines designed to be guided to a target by their pilot, who was expected to die in the explosion. They represented the same logic as the kamikaze aircraft. The strategic situation was hopeless, but the act of dying for Japan retained meaning within Japanese military culture, even when the practical effect was minimal. Of all the operations Japanese submarines conducted against the continental United States, the most unusual was also the most operationally successful, and it produced the most unlikely post-war story. Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita was the floatplane pilot assigned to I-25. He had trained as a naval aviator, received a posting to submarine aviation, and spent the early months of the war in standard patrol operations. In September of 1942, I-25 surfaced at night off the Oregon coast, assembled the floatplane from its watertight hangar, and launched Fujita on a mission to bomb the forests southeast of the coastal town of Brookings. The logic was straightforward. Oregon's forests were a strategic resource. The United States had lumber mills, shipbuilding operations, and industrial facilities that depended on Pacific Northwest timber. More importantly, the Pacific Northwest had experienced terrible forest fires in the past, and a fire in the right conditions could spread across hundreds of miles of tinder-dry forest in late summer. The Japanese had already tried sending balloon bombs across the Pacific, carrying incendiary devices, with limited success. The floatplane offered a more precise delivery method. Fujita made 2 flights, dropping incendiary bombs on both. Small fires started on both missions and were quickly contained by Forest Service personnel and favorable weather conditions. The strategic impact was minimal, but the missions themselves were genuinely historic. They were the only attacks by foreign aircraft on continental American territory in the entire war. The Japanese Navy attempted to keep the attacks secret, believing that revealing them would help the Americans track the submarine. American authorities also suppressed the story initially to prevent civilian panic and to deny the Japanese any propaganda value. The result was that Fujita's missions remained obscure for years. Fujita survived the war. In the 1960s, the city of Brookings, Oregon, invited him to return for a ceremony acknowledging what had happened, and he accepted. He brought his family's ceremonial sword with him as a symbol of apology, prepared to present it to the city and accept responsibility for what he had done. The mayor of Brookings declined the sword and told him to keep it, expressing the city's desire to move forward rather than relitigate the war. He returned to Brookings several more times over the following decades. The city eventually made him an honorary citizen. He planted a tree near the bomb site. He died in 1997. The city of Brookings lowered its flags to half-staff. It is one of the more unusual post-war reconciliation stories produced by the Pacific Campaign, and it started with a floatplane bomb that failed to start a serious forest fire. The contrast between what happened to Japanese merchant shipping and what happened to American merchant shipping is the clearest way to see how thoroughly the strategic balance had shifted by 1944. Japanese submarines sank enough American warships in 1942 to produce genuine alarm at the highest levels of American command. The losses of Wasp and the repeated damage to Saratoga, combined with the losses at Midway and Coral Sea, created a moment when the American carrier force in the Pacific was reduced to a single operational ship. If Hornet had been sunk in September of 1942, the American Navy would have had no carriers in the Pacific at all, and the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign would have been far less certain. But the Japanese submarines that achieved those results were using their boats the way their doctrine told them to, and their doctrine told them to attack warships while ignoring the supply lines that kept the American war economy functioning. The Pacific supply routes were long and vulnerable. Japan ignored those supply routes entirely. American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships. They sank 200 warships ranging from destroyers to carriers to one battleship. They transported ammunition and supplies to guerrilla forces in the Philippines. They rescued hundreds of American aviators shot down over the Pacific. For every American submariner killed, approximately 28 Japanese soldiers died. The United States lost 52 submarines and 3,500 men. Japan lost 128 submarines and essentially lost the war at sea. Dönitz had argued from the beginning of the Atlantic campaign that the decisive objective of submarine warfare was merchant shipping, not warships. He built his entire strategy around strangling British trade routes. He was right about the theory, and the British nearly lost the war because he was right about it. In the Pacific, both sides demonstrated the same principle from opposite directions. The Americans used submarines to destroy Japan's trade routes, and Japan's economy collapsed. The Japanese used submarines to destroy American warships, and America built more warships. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, wrote after the war that the American submarine campaign had been decisive. He was not exaggerating for effect. The oil that powered Japan's ships, aircraft, and vehicles came by sea. Once the tankers started going to the bottom, every other problem Japan faced in the Pacific became harder. Aircraft flew shorter missions to conserve fuel. Ships reduced their operational tempo. Ground forces waited for supplies that didn't arrive. The numbers, by late 1944, were no longer arguable. Japan was losing submarines faster than it could replace them. American production was running at roughly 70 boats per year. The submarine service that had sunk 2 carriers in 6 weeks in 1942 was being systematically dismantled, and the doctrinal choices that had sent those boats after warships rather than merchants had ensured that when the American counterpressure came, there was no economic shock absorber to slow it down. The merchant fleet that might have fueled the defense of the home islands was already on the bottom of the Pacific, put there by American boats that had made a different choice. Japan spent 4 decades building the finest fleet submarines in the world. The I-class boats had twice the range of German U-boats. They could carry aircraft. They could operate anywhere in the Pacific. They were technological achievements that no other navy matched. Japan put the people and the steel and the decades of engineering thought into building submarines that were genuinely remarkable. The American submarines they fought were good boats with good crews and eventually good torpedoes. They were smaller than the I-boats and shorter ranged. They were built for a different kind of war, but the American submarines were fighting the right war. They were going after what mattered: the tankers, the cargo ships, the supply vessels that carried the oil and food and raw materials that an island empire needed to sustain a war it had started. The Japanese submarines were going after aircraft carriers. The Americans built 32 new fleet and light carriers between 1942 and the end of the war, plus more than 100 escort carriers, because they had the shipyards and the steel and the industrial capacity. Sinking American warships was something you could do, and Japanese submarines did it skillfully, but it was a problem America could replace. Japan's tankers were a problem Japan couldn't replace, because the American submarines were sinking the steel and the oil that would have built the replacements. That's the thing about a century of naval doctrine. It only works until someone decides to fight a different war than the one you trained for. Japan built the most capable fleet submarines in the Pacific and used them to attack warships, while the Americans used good enough submarines to attack everything else. The I-400 class submarines, the largest boats ever built to bomb American cities from the sea, surrendered at anchor in Tokyo Bay in September of 1945. The American Navy surveyed them carefully, gathered what intelligence could be gathered, and then sank them all before the Soviet Union could inspect them. The technology that had represented decades of Japanese naval engineering went to the bottom of the Pacific. The war they were built to fight had already been lost. What ended it wasn't the warships the Japanese submarines had attacked. It was the absence of oil that the American submarines had ensured.